A student went out for a bike ride, but never made it back home. From the very first days, her disappearance sparked one of the largest searches the city had ever seen, and soon, the whole country was talking about this case. Detectives chased down thousands of tips and looked into hundreds of suspects, but every lead turned into a dead end. That's how it went, until an unexpected twist finally revealed the chilling truth. Ardeth Wood was born on October 28, 1975, in St. John, Canada. Not long after, she became a big sister to two younger brothers, and the family eventually moved to Ottawa. That's where Ardeth went through Catholic school and later enrolled in university, diving into history and philosophy. After earning her degrees, she decided to keep going and enrolled at another university near Toronto to pursue a PhD in philosophy. Ardeth was genuinely passionate about it and pictured herself teaching at a top university one day. Her professors often remarked on her exceptional talent. In fact, at times they felt like they were talking to a colleague rather than a student. Outside the classroom, she was active and athletic. She loved swimming, running, and cycling. She also dreamed of having a big family, and she was in a serious relationship, planning to marry her boyfriend after finishing her PhD. In the summer of 2003, when she was 27, Ardeth decided to visit her family in Ottawa and spend 2 weeks with them. Her university was about 300 miles away from home, so she didn't get to see her loved ones very often. Since they were such a close-knit family, being apart for that long was tough on her, and she planned to spend as much time with them as possible during her break. On the morning of August 6th, Ardeth got up early and went for a run. When she came back, she made a strawberry dessert for her parents and brothers. Later that day, she and her mom were planning to go shopping, but the forecast warned that heavy rain was on the way. So, Ardeth decided to head out for a bike ride while the weather was still holding up. She promised her mom she'd be back in about an hour and a half, borrowed her brother's bike, and rode off. An hour and a half later, the rain the forecast had promised finally came pouring down, but Ardeth still hadn't returned. Her mom figured she'd gotten caught in the storm and was probably waiting it out under some kind of shelter. But as time passed, the rain stopped, and Ardeth was still nowhere to be seen. Worried, her mom called her husband, who quickly went out with their sons to search for her. They drove along the city's long park trail, a popular spot for cyclists. As kids, Ardeth and her brothers had spent countless hours biking there, so her family assumed that's where she might have gone. But it was only a guess. Before leaving, Ardeth hadn't told anyone exactly where she planned to ride, and her father and brothers couldn't find any trace of her. By then, it was already starting to get dark, and her family was in a panic. More than 6 hours had passed since she'd left the house, and they were almost certain something bad had happened. They decided it was time to call the police. But the local police department didn't launch a full search right away, since Ardeth was 27 years old. Her family, though, refused to just sit around and wait. They started calling friends and neighbors, asking them to help. Dozens of people joined the search, combing through bike trails all over the city late into the night. Still, there was no sign of Ardeth. The biggest problem was that Ottawa's bike paths stretched more than 100 miles, and no one knew which route she had taken. All they could do was guess that she'd chosen the closest one to home. The next morning, police finally joined the search and set up a command post at the Aviation Museum, a spot where several major bike trails intersected. They brought in dozens of officers and also reached out to the public for help. Photos of Ardeth were handed out to newspapers and TV stations, and volunteers were urged to join the search. The community's response was overwhelming. Within just hours, hundreds of locals joined the search. Mounted police showed up, along with helicopters and even the military. Very quickly, the search for Ardeth became one of the biggest in Ottawa's history. But, despite the massive effort, there was still no trace of her. News of Ardeth's disappearance spread quickly across the city, and soon police were flooded with hundreds of calls and tips. In the very first days, several women came forward with eerily similar stories. Each of them said they'd been approached by a man, and from their descriptions, it sounded like the same guy every time. They explained that he would approach them on bike paths or park trails that ran along the river, not far from the very spot where police had set up their command post. One woman told officers that he rode up to her on a bike, and at first he seemed very nice. He was fit, good-looking, and started off with casual small talk. But then, out of nowhere, he tried to pull her off her bike and drag her into the trees. Terrified, she managed to break free and sped away. Based on her account, police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect, but they decided not to release it to the public. They were already overwhelmed with tips, and without solid evidence to connect him to Ardeth's disappearance, putting out the sketch would only create even more noise. Even if someone recognized him and gave them a name, they'd have no way to prove the link. So they held off. But in the following days, more women came forward with nearly identical stories. A man matching the same description approached them in local parks, acted strangely, and in some cases even tried to drag them off the trail into the woods. Another lead came from a 16-year-old girl who had been riding her bike in the park. She told police that she'd seen Ardeth's photo on the news and immediately recognized her because she'd actually spotted her in the park on the day she vanished. According to the teen, she rode past Ardeth, but just a few seconds later heard a woman scream. When she turned around, she saw Ardeth standing with a man, and it looked like they were arguing. She kept going, but when she looked back again, she saw the man walking into the woods with Ardeth beside him. Something about it didn't feel right, so she circled back. By the time she returned, though, they were gone. Curious but uneasy, she went a little further into the trees. First, she noticed a hat hanging on a branch. Then, just a few steps later, she came across 2 bikes lying on the ground. But there was no sign of Ardeth or the man, and at that point, she decided not to go any deeper. She convinced herself she might just be overthinking things, that maybe she'd only witnessed a couple having an argument. As she rode away, though, she thought she heard another scream. She couldn't be sure if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. When police later showed her the composite sketch created from the other women's descriptions, she confirmed that it looked a lot like the man she saw with Ardeth that day. This pushed detectives towards the theory that Ardeth had been abducted, and now they had a better idea of where it might have happened. They swept through the park with hundreds of volunteers, and even brought in divers to search the long, narrow river running through the area. 4 days after Ardeth went missing, the effort finally paid off. Divers pulled a bike from the bottom of the river, and the serial number confirmed it belonged to Ardeth's brother. At that point, detectives realized the chances of finding her alive were slim, and they shifted all their focus to the riverbanks. That same day, police got a call unlike any of the tips they'd received before. On the other end of the line was a man who sounded panicked. He said he had accidentally killed Ardeth near a bike path. According to him, it wasn't planned, it was some kind of accident. He went on to say that afterward, he partially buried her body near the riverbank and covered it with branches. Investigators traced the call and learned it had come from a payphone in a nearby town. They rushed to the scene, hoping the caller might have left behind fingerprints or DNA on the phone. But once again, they came up empty. Meanwhile, police brought in search dogs to comb both sides of the river where Ardeth's bike had turned up. And the very next day, the dogs led them to a body lying just a few feet from the water, partially hidden under branches. The decomposition was so advanced that investigators couldn't identify it by sight, and there were no clothes on it. But they knew almost instantly it had to be Ardeth. They turned the remains over to medical examiners and combed the crime scene, but there was nothing. No footprints, no belongings, nothing that could point them toward a suspect. Later, medical experts confirmed the victim was Ardeth. They determined she had drowned, most likely held underwater until she died. Afterward, her killer dragged her onto the riverbank and tried to cover her with branches. Since police couldn't find any of her clothing, it was clear the killer had taken it with him. Examiners couldn't say for sure if Ardeth had been sexually assaulted, but everything about the scene pointed strongly in that direction. After Ardeth's body was found, investigators decided to release the composite sketch of the suspect, and it triggered a flood of new tips. Many women said a man matching that description had harassed them in local parks, but none of it brought police closer to putting a name to the face. Over time, detectives built a list of several hundred possible suspects, checking each one carefully, but still couldn't tie anyone directly to Ardeth's murder. They also looked into the possibility that a serial offender was responsible, the same man who had assaulted several women in the nearby town where the confession call to police had come from. That predator had attacked multiple women just a year earlier and was never caught. Detectives tried hard to link the two cases, but once again, they hit a dead end. Even so, tips kept flooding in, and investigators were struck by how many women had run into a man who looked like the composite sketch. But when they pieced it all together, they realized he'd been spotted in that very park at least 19 times in the week before Ardeth disappeared. Even more chilling, one woman saw him the day after the murder, before Ardeth's body had been discovered. Detectives believed he might have returned to the scene to hide the body better, or to collect evidence before police could find it. There was one more detail witnesses kept bringing up. Many of them said the man had an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. At first, detectives kept that information to themselves because it was their strongest lead. But as the weeks dragged on and they were no closer to making an arrest, they decided to release it to the public. As a result, hundreds of calls came in about men with similar tattoos. Detectives followed up on every single one, but once again, it led nowhere. In the months that followed, detectives kept working through the flood of tips, more than 4,000 in total. They tried to chase down every lead, which was an overwhelming task. Eventually, though, two specific calls caught their attention. One came in shortly after Ardeth's body was found, and the other arrived months later. But both callers pointed to the same man, a local who lived in the same town where the confession call had been made from that payphone. In fact, he lived in the very neighborhood where that payphone stood. On top of that, he had a criminal record, and he had a bird tattoo on his shoulder that matched what witnesses described. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and his behavior was strange. At one point, he even told them they'd never figure out what he was doing on the day Ardeth was killed, because he was as elusive as a scorpion. Investigators grilled him for 3 hours, but he gave them nothing useful. So they called him back for a second interview, this time with a polygraph. By then, detectives were nearly convinced this was their guy, but the results completely blindsided them. The polygraph examiner didn't flag a single lie. With no hard evidence to hold the suspect on, detectives had no choice but to let him go. And the clean polygraph results left them questioning whether he was really their suspect after all. Over time, the flood of tips finally dried up, but detectives kept going through the old ones, one by one. A year after the murder, their lead investigator told reporters that they were still working through their suspect list, which had around 400 men on it. Most had already been ruled out, but a chunk of them were still question marks. Police also put up a $50,000 reward, the biggest ever put up in Ottawa at the time. But not even that was enough to bring them any closer to finding the killer. By the 2-year mark, detectives had run out of leads, and the case basically went cold. That's how it stayed until September 2005, when another young woman vanished in Ottawa. 18-year-old Jennifer Teague, whose story we've already covered on this channel. Investigators immediately looked for a possible link, since the two cases seemed so similar. But in the end, no connection was ever found. After that, the case sat cold for almost another year, and detectives were beginning to doubt they'd ever solve it. They had no physical evidence, and despite all the eyewitness accounts, they still couldn't put a name to the mysterious man seen in the park. But then, on May 2006, everything suddenly changed. Police in North Bay, a city about 190 miles from Ottawa, got a call from an attempted assault. A woman reported that she was walking home late at night when a man approached her and asked if he could walk with her. She said no and kept going, but he followed, claiming he needed help. He told her he had just moved from Ottawa and couldn't find the address he was looking for. As she started giving him directions, the man suddenly grabbed her and dragged her into the bushes. He tried to assault her, but the woman screamed and nearby residents heard it. One man even ran outside with a shovel and scared the attacker off. The suspect bolted, dropping his phone as he ran. That mistake cost him dearly. Police quickly tracked him down and arrested him. The man was 25-year-old Christopher Myers, who had only recently moved to North Bay from Ottawa. While preparing the case against him, the lead detective suddenly remembered hearing about the Ardeth Wood case at a police conference. He dug out the handouts from that event, and among them was a composite sketch of the suspect. The resemblance to Christopher was uncanny. He immediately passed the tip on to investigators in Ottawa, who started taking a closer look at Myers. The first thing they realized was that police had actually spoken to Christopher in the early weeks after Ardeth's disappearance. An anonymous tipster had called the hotline and named him as a suspect. Detectives had checked him out, but found nothing solid linking him to the crime. He even seemed to have an alibi. The woman who rented him a room said she'd seen him earlier in the day, and by 3 p.m., he had already left for his work shift. Since Ardeth was believed to have been attacked around 1:30, it seemed likely he simply wouldn't have had the time to be in the park. About a year later, Christopher's name popped up again when another tip came in. This time, police decided to take a closer look at him and brought him in for questioning. He denied having anything to do with Ardeth's murder, and even showed them his shoulders to prove he had no tattoos, something that made detectives doubt whether he really was their guy. But now, with Christopher back on their radar for the 3rd time, and given the fact that he had just tried to drag another woman into the bushes, detectives started seeing him as their prime suspect. The problem was, they still needed hard evidence to prove it. The first thing they did was revisit his alibi. Originally, his landlady had told police she saw him at home during the day, which seemed to clear him. But when investigators went back and spoke with her again, she clarified that she had actually seen him in the morning. That small detail changed everything. It meant that he had plenty of time to ride his bike from his house to the park, attack Ardeth, and still make it to his afternoon shift. To be sure, police even retraced the entire route by bike themselves and confirmed it was absolutely possible. Eventually, detectives went to the neighboring city to question Christopher. At first, he flat out denied having anything to do with it, but when they told him that multiple women had spotted him in the park, his story started to change. He admitted he'd been riding his bike there that day, and even claimed he ran into Ardeth and struck up a conversation with her. According to Christopher, after a brief chat, Ardeth supposedly agreed to walk with him into the woods by the river. But then, he claimed, another girl appeared, spooking Ardeth and causing her to fall into the water. He said he left right away, but later came back, only to find her already drowned. That's when he claimed he pulled her body onto the shore, covered it with branches, and simply walked away without telling anyone what had happened. Detectives knew the story was complete nonsense, but at the same time, Christopher had just admitted to having contact with Ardeth on the day of the murder. What's more, the other girl in his tale sounded a lot like the 16-year-old witness who reported hearing a scream and spotting Ardeth with a man before they vanished into the woods. It seemed like Christopher had taken her account from the news and twisted it into his own version. Not long after, he backtracked again, saying the whole story was a lie. He claimed he had never been in the park at all, that he had only heard about Ardeth's case from the news, and made everything up based on publicly available details. Detectives then put him on a polygraph, and he failed. Even so, Christopher kept insisting he was innocent, and without solid physical evidence, police couldn't charge him with murder. While Christopher was still behind bars in the neighboring city, detectives started digging into his past, hoping to uncover anything that could tie him to Ardeth's murder. They learned that his mother had been drinking and using drugs while pregnant, which left Christopher with mental health issues from an early age. To make matters worse, she physically abused him until, at age 4, he was adopted by another family. But 8 years later, even they gave up on him. His behavior had become deeply disturbing and impossible to manage. He talked to himself constantly, stripped naked in public, and grew more aggressive with each passing year. One psychologist who treated him even said Christopher was the most frightening child he had ever worked with. On the surface, his adult life looked more stable. He managed to hold a job, find housing, and mostly stayed off the police radar, aside from a few drug-related arrests. He even had girlfriends, and detectives tracked some of them down to ask about his past. One ex described how Christopher would frequently fly into rages and sometimes hit her. She also confirmed that he was always riding his bike around parks. But then she told detectives something that stunned them. Christopher had a habit of giving himself temporary tattoos, and more than once, she'd seen an eagle tattoo inked onto his shoulder. This information became the missing piece of the puzzle, the final detail that convinced detectives Christopher really was their guy. Up until then, the tattoo could have blown the whole case apart. If he really hadn't had it, every eyewitness account would have fallen flat. But with a witness now confirming he did have that eagle tattoo on his shoulder, detectives knew they weren't chasing shadows anymore. Still, it wasn't nearly enough to bring the case to trial. What they needed was a confession. 5 months after his arrest for the attempted assault, detectives brought him back in for questioning. This time, with backup. They invited in an experienced investigator from the UK, someone with a reputation for getting people to talk. At first, Christopher flat out denied having anything to do with Ardeth's murder. But later, he slipped back into the same story he told before, the one about meeting her by the river, kissing her, and then claiming she drowned after another girl startled her. Then, just as quickly, he took it all back. But not long after, he drew detectives a map showing where he said he first met Ardeth and the spot where they supposedly went together. He even agreed to take them out there and point everything out in person. But once they actually arrived, Christopher suddenly changed his tune again, saying he didn't recognize the park at all. So, while his story wasn't a full confession, it was just enough to keep him on the hook. But detectives had something else up their sleeve. They believed Christopher might not only be tied to Ardeth's murder, but also to a string of unsolved sexual assaults that had happened around Ottawa at the very same time. The pattern was always the same. A man would approach women on the street, strike up a conversation, then suddenly attack and sexually assault them. When police spoke to the victims and showed them Christopher's photo, several of them confirmed without hesitation he was the one who attacked them. Armed with this, detectives hauled him in for another round of questioning. This time, after hours of pressure, Christopher finally broke and admitted to 5 separate assaults. That confession gave police what they needed: additional charges and, combined with everything else, a much stronger case against him for Ardeth's murder. In the end, Christopher was finally charged with murder, and the case went to trial. It took years to get there, but in January 2008, prosecutors put a deal on the table. If he pled guilty, they dropped the charge from first-degree to second-degree murder. In the end, Christopher took the deal. He admitted that he approached Ardeth on the bike path, dragged her into the woods with the intent to assault her, and then drowned her in the river. He also pled guilty to several other attacks on women. For all of this, he got a life sentence, but with the possibility of parole after just 10 years. That leniency was part of the plea deal, though it didn't mean he'd actually walk free. His first chance at parole came in 2015, but the board flat out denied it. 5 years later, in 2020, he tried again and was turned down once more. This time, experts made it clear, even after 15 years behind bars, he was still considered highly likely to re-offend. As of today, Christopher is still in prison, and it's unlikely he'll ever walk free. Ardeth Wood's murder became one of the most infamous cases in Ottawa's history, leaving deep scars on the community. For years afterward, women were terrified to walk in parks or ride their bikes alone. Locals even organized volunteer patrols along the bike paths, groups of people riding together to watch over each other and prevent anything like this from happening again. And one last note. While Christopher admitted to several assaults, detectives were convinced he had committed many more. The issue was that not all of his victims ever saw his face, which made it impossible to tie him directly to every case. As for the Jennifer Teague case mentioned earlier in this story, you'll find the link to that video in the description. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.